On February 14, 1943, at Tunisia's Kasserine Pass, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, sat inside his command tent, carefully examining intelligence reports with the self-assurance of someone who'd been outmaneuvering British forces throughout North Africa for 2 solid years. His Afrika Korps had recently dealt a crushing defeat to inexperienced American troops. The path toward Allied failure appeared completely open before him. However, just 1,500 meters away, there was a man Rommel had yet to encounter in combat, someone who was analyzing those same maps and making calculations that would completely upend the entire North African theater of war. In less than a day, every assumption Rommel held about American military capabilities would be completely destroyed. What unfolded next went far beyond a simple military defeat. This was a demonstration of psychological warfare at its finest, tactical improvisation at its peak, and the kind of bold risk-taking that distinguishes legendary military commanders from those who are merely adequate. The account you're about to discover includes direct excerpts from Rommel's own war diary, captured German radio transmissions, and testimony given after the war that shows just how thoroughly one man's brilliance could dismantle another's meticulously crafted strategy. These are stories you won't discover anywhere else. Make sure to subscribe to Frontline America, World War II, right now, so you don't miss any new videos. Leave a comment down below, telling me which element of Patton's tactical brilliance interests you the most, or just let me know what part of the world you're watching from. 3 weeks earlier, to fully grasp what transpired during that single crucial day, we need to go back 3 weeks earlier. On January 23, 1943, Lieutenant General George S. Patton had just touched down in Morocco to assume command of the devastated Second Corps. The Americans had taken 6,000 casualties at Kasserine Pass during their first significant clash with German forces. Morale had been completely destroyed. Equipment was scattered everywhere. All discipline had fallen apart. General Eisenhower's evaluation was harsh and direct. The American soldier hasn't yet learned how to truly hate the enemy. When Patton stepped off that plane, he was wearing a custom-designed uniform with 2 ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his sides, and his expression was what one staff officer later described as fury mixed with absolute confidence. His very first order caught everyone completely off guard. He had no intention of comforting the troops or slowly rebuilding their shattered confidence. Instead, he gathered his officers together and spoke words that would eventually become legendary. "I don't want any messages coming in saying we're holding our position. We're not holding a damn thing. Let the Germans do that. Our approach is constant forward movement." Patton studies Rommel. However, Patton possessed knowledge his officers lacked. He'd spent months studying Rommel, not just his battlefield tactics, but his psychological patterns, his behavioral tendencies, his vulnerabilities. In personal notes dated February 2nd, Patton had written, "Rommel shows predictability within his unpredictability. He feints, then commits everything where you least expect it, but there's definitely a pattern to it. He invariably pushes his successes too far. That's exactly where I'll break him." Meanwhile, Rommel was developing what he believed would be the final decisive strike. His diary entry from February 10th shows us his mindset. The Americans simply don't have the stomach for prolonged combat. Sure, their equipment is better, but their leadership is overly cautious, and their coordination is terrible. One more decisive blow at their center, and Eisenhower will have no choice but to pull out of North Africa completely. The British would be standing alone once again, and we already know how that story ends. Rommel's target, Rommel, had pinpointed what seemed to him like the perfect objective: the American positions at Gafsa, a desert town that controlled crucial supply routes. Intelligence reports indicated minimal American defenses, maybe 3,000 troops who were scattered and completely demoralized. German intelligence had intercepted American radio communications that were filled with confusion and desperate pleas for reinforcements. Every piece of evidence suggested an easy victory that would create a clear corridor straight to the coast. What Rommel had no way of knowing was that every single piece of intelligence in his possession had been deliberately falsified. Operation Fabrication Patton had arrived at 2nd Corps headquarters on February 6th and immediately launched what he dubbed Operation Fabrication. He instructed radio operators to transmit messages using codes that were deliberately easy to break, intentionally portraying American positions as severely undermanned and requesting authorization for immediate withdrawal. He positioned dummy vehicles to create the appearance of a retreating force. He even orchestrated a fake heated argument with his logistics officer within earshot of suspected Axis informants among the local population, loudly complaining that they didn't have enough fuel to launch any offensive operations for at least 10 days. Colonel Oscar Koch, who served as Patton's intelligence officer, later provided this testimony. The general grasped something fundamental about the situation. Rommel was brilliant, certainly, but he was also arrogant. He expected Americans to behave predictably, cautiously, and to react slowly. Patton deliberately gave him exactly what he expected to observe, right up until it was far too late to make any difference. Rommel orders the attack on February 13th. Rommel issued his orders for the attack. The German 21st Panzer Division, consisting of 142 operational tanks and 8,000 battle-hardened troops, would launch their assault on Gafsa right at dawn on February 14th. This would be classic blitzkrieg warfare: rapid penetration, complete encirclement, and total annihilation. The Italian Centauro Division would follow behind to secure and consolidate whatever gains were made. Rommel's personal notes from that evening clearly reveal his supreme confidence. Tomorrow, we shatter the American center. By the end of the week, we'll have driven them back 200 kilometers. After that, the desert itself will finish the job. But that same evening, 400 miles to the west, Patton was putting the final touches on a plan so incredibly audacious that when he laid it out before his staff, 3 senior officers formally registered their objections. Patton's response was documented by his aide, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Codman. "Gentlemen, Rommel believes he's the hunter in this scenario. Tomorrow morning, he's going to discover that he's actually the prey, the hidden trap." Here's what Patton had managed to orchestrate behind the scenes. While creating the appearance of retreating from Gafsa, he had secretly repositioned the entire 1st Armored Division, 390 tanks, into hidden wadis located 30 miles southeast of the town. The 1st Infantry Division, numbering 16,000 men strong, had moved under complete cover of darkness into positions that would effectively cut off any German advance. Most brilliantly of all, Patton had coordinated with British forces to create what he called the hammer and anvil. British artillery units that were supposedly engaged elsewhere had quietly moved into position to create what would become a killing field. The sheer scale of this deception operation was absolutely staggering. Patton had successfully moved over 25,000 troops, 400 tanks, and 200 artillery pieces into offensive positions while maintaining the complete illusion of disorganized retreat. Every single movement happened exclusively at night. Radio silence was maintained absolutely except for those fake transmissions. Even Eisenhower wasn't given the full briefing on the plan. Patton was well aware that intelligence leaks existed at the highest command levels, and he trusted absolutely no one. February 14th. The trap springs. The morning of February 14th broke cold and clear across the Tunisian desert. At 5:30 a.m., German reconnaissance units reported back exactly what they'd been expecting to find. Gafsa appeared only lightly defended, with clear evidence of recent American evacuation. At 6:20 a.m., Rommel's panzers launched their advance in 3 separate columns, moving at high speed across the open terrain. The Desert Fox himself was positioned with the lead elements, personally directing what he fully expected to be a triumphant breakthrough. At 6:45 a.m., precisely when the German lead tanks had reached exactly where Patton had predicted they would be, the entire landscape suddenly erupted in fire. American artillery, carefully positioned on 3 sides, opened fire all at once. The bombardment was so incredibly intense that German radio operators described it as unlike anything they'd ever encountered during the entire Desert War. Within just minutes, 23 German tanks were already burning. But this wasn't random defensive fire thrown up in desperation. This was directed, coordinated devastation specifically designed to funnel the German advance into a progressively narrowing corridor. Rommel's fatal mistake. Rommel's immediate reaction revealed both his brilliant tactical instincts and his fatal misreading of what he was actually facing. At 6:58 a.m., intercepted German communications captured his exact order. Push straight through. This is just desperate fire from already broken units. Maintain your speed and break through their center. He genuinely believed the Americans were simply throwing everything they had left into one last desperate defensive stand. He couldn't possibly have been more mistaken. At 7:15 a.m., Patton's 1st Armored Division burst out from concealment and crashed directly into the German southern flank, not with a tentative probing attack, but with a full-speed assault featuring 390 tanks advancing in perfectly coordinated waves. German tank commander Hans von Luck later wrote about it. We had been repeatedly told that the Americans couldn't possibly coordinate armor operations effectively. What slammed into us that morning was more tactically sophisticated than anything Montgomery had ever thrown at us. They maneuvered like chess pieces being controlled by a single mastermind. The transformation. The complete transformation of American forces in just 3 weeks seemed absolutely impossible to comprehend. These were the exact same units that had shattered and broken at Kasserine Pass. But Patton had ruthlessly removed ineffective officers, promoted aggressive junior commanders based on merit, and drilled his forces relentlessly in the precise scenario they were now executing to perfection. He had told them directly, "The Germans think you're all cowards. In 1 hour, you're going to teach them the most expensive lesson of their entire lives." At 7:42 a.m., Rommel finally realized his catastrophic mistake. An intercepted transmission captured his exact words: "We're not fighting retreating Americans here. This is a carefully prepared trap. All units shift to defensive formation and prepare to withdraw immediately." But Patton had anticipated even this inevitable response. The box closes. The instant German forces attempted to pull back, the 1st Infantry Division surged forward, systematically cutting off all retreat routes. British artillery positioned at precisely calculated intervals created a box from which there was simply no easy escape. Rommel's panzers, specifically designed for mobile warfare across open desert, suddenly found themselves trapped in a brutal meat grinder. The battle that Rommel had confidently expected to win within 3 hours stretched out into 8 hours of absolutely brutal close-quarters combat. By 2 p.m., German casualties had become catastrophic. 89 tanks either destroyed outright or captured, over 2,000 casualties, and most devastating of all for Rommel, his aura of complete invincibility had been shattered forever. American forces had certainly suffered their share of losses, too. 41 tanks destroyed and 670 casualties. But the psychological impact was entirely one-sided. Rommel's realization. What transpired in Rommel's command post that afternoon later became the subject of numerous post-war accounts. His chief of staff, General Alfred Gauss, provided this testimony. The field marshal sat in complete silence for nearly an entire hour after receiving the full casualty reports. Then he requested his personal diary. What he wrote down, which I read directly over his shoulder, said this: "I have severely underestimated the Americans, not their equipment, but their will to fight. Someone has taught them to think like Germans and fight like absolute madmen. Find out immediately who commands them." When Rommel finally learned that the commander was Patton, his response was recorded by multiple witnesses present. He said simply and quietly, "Ah, now it all makes sense. German intelligence files that were captured after the war clearly showed that Rommel had actually been reading about Patton since 1941, his combat service in World War I, his published theories on armored warfare, his well-known reputation for aggressive action. But Rommel had made the mistake of dismissing him as merely a theorist, not a practitioner. That single assessment error cost him the entire battle, the nighttime raid. But here's where this story becomes truly fascinating on a deeper level. Patton wasn't remotely satisfied with just achieving a tactical victory on the battlefield. He understood perfectly that wars are ultimately won inside the minds of commanders just as much as they're won on actual battlefields. That very evening, he ordered something completely unprecedented, a nighttime armored raid directly on Rommel's own headquarters. At 2:30 a.m., a specially hand-picked force of 200 men in 40 jeeps and light tanks successfully penetrated German defensive lines using captured passwords they'd obtained from prisoners earlier. Their mission wasn't actually to kill Rommel himself. It was specifically to terrify him on a psychological level. They struck the headquarters compound hard, systematically destroyed communications equipment, captured several staff officers, and withdrew completely before German forces could even properly react. The entire raid lasted exactly 17 minutes. American casualties totaled 3 wounded. The psychological impact, however, was absolutely immense. Rommel, who had built his entire legendary reputation on launching aggressive, completely unexpected attacks, had just been attacked in his own headquarters by the supposedly timid Americans. His diary entry from that night, which was published years after the war, clearly reveals his mental state. They have learned far too quickly. Even worse, they have a commander who consistently thinks 3 moves ahead of everyone else. The Americans are no longer the weak link in the Allied chain. God help us all. The transformation of American forces. What makes this entire story so remarkable isn't simply the military execution itself. It's the sheer audacity of Patton's overall approach to the problem. He had assumed command of a defeated, completely demoralized force, and within just 21 days had transformed them into a unit fully capable of outfighting Rommel's battle-hardened veterans. He accomplished this through a potent combination of brutal discipline, sophisticated psychological manipulation, and pure tactical brilliance. Captain Harry Semmes, who served directly under Patton's command, later described the transformation this way: "On January 23rd, we were genuinely a beaten army. By February 14th, we believed with absolute certainty that we were invincible, not because Patton fed us comfortable lies, but because he made us prove it to ourselves through action." He predicted down to the details exactly what would happen in that battle, and when everything happened precisely as he'd said it would, we completely stopped doubting him. More importantly, we stopped doubting ourselves entirely. The numbers tell the story. The raw numbers from that single day tell their own powerful story. German forces suffered 2,247 total casualties and lost 89 tanks, which represented nearly 30% of their entire armored strength throughout Tunisia. American forces captured or completely destroyed supplies estimated to be worth $4.3 million in 1943 dollars. But the strategic impact reached far beyond these immediate tactical gains. Rommel's offensive momentum, which had successfully driven the Allies back 200 kilometers in previous weeks, stopped completely dead. He would never again launch any major offensive operation in North Africa. Berlin's reaction. In Berlin, the reaction to news of this stunning defeat was a mixture of fury and complete disbelief. General Wilhelm Keitel, who headed the Wehrmacht High Command, wrote directly to Rommel, "How is it remotely possible that Rommel, the victor of Tobruk and conqueror of British armies, has been defeated by untested Americans in a prepared battle? Explain this immediately." Rommel's response was brutally honest and direct. "The Americans have finally found their general. His name is Patton. We should have eliminated him when we had the opportunity back in 1918. This specific reference to 1918 is particularly revealing. Rommel had actually studied Patton's combat service in World War I, when then Colonel Patton had led the very first American tank unit in actual combat. German after-action reports from the Battle of Saint-Mihiel had specifically noted Patton's exceptionally aggressive leadership style. But 25 years later, the Germans had simply assumed that kind of warrior spirit couldn't possibly survive within the bureaucratic American military system. They were catastrophically, fatally wrong in that assumption. Rommel's evacuation. Over the following weeks, as American forces steadily pushed Rommel's Afrika Korps progressively eastward, the Field Marshal's diary entries reveal a man gradually coming to terms with a harsh new reality. On March 3rd, he wrote, Patton attacks at exactly the points where I would attack. He feints precisely where I would feint. Fighting him is like fighting a mirror image of myself, except one with vastly better supplies. The American soldier who appeared so soft and weak at Kasserine now fights with a confidence level that genuinely terrifies my veterans. On March 9th, facing complete encirclement, Rommel received orders to evacuate North Africa entirely and return to Germany. His final diary entry from Tunisia, dated March 8th, contained this sobering assessment. We came to Africa to prove German superiority beyond question. We leave having proven only that courage and will are not uniquely German traits. After all, the Americans possess both qualities in remarkable abundance. Their commander, this Patton, has clearly demonstrated that 3 weeks of proper leadership can completely erase a year's worth of defeats. I pray to God I never have to face him again on any battlefield. The human dimension. It's definitely worth examining the human dimension of what actually happened on February 14th. Rommel wasn't simply outmaneuvered on a tactical level, he was psychologically dismantled as a commander. German prisoners who were captured that day consistently reported that their officers seemed genuinely shocked and completely unable to comprehend what had just happened to them. These were men who had conquered most of North Africa, who had pushed experienced British forces right to the brink of total defeat. To be so thoroughly outwitted by Americans they'd been consistently taught to view as inferior shook something absolutely fundamental in their entire worldview. Conversely, the American troops experienced a transformation that went far beyond simple military success on the battlefield. Private James Crawford, who had fought at both Kasserine Pass and in this February 14th battle, wrote home to his family, "3 weeks ago, I genuinely thought we'd lose this war. Today, I know with certainty we can't possibly lose, not because our equipment is superior, though it definitely is. Not because we're inherently braver than them, we're not, but because we finally have a general who truly understands that winning starts in your head first, not in your foxhole." Impact on American morale. The ripple effects of this single day's events extended far beyond just North Africa. When news finally reached American newspapers in late February, the headlines completely transformed public perception of the war. "Patton smashes Rommel," declared the New York Times boldly. "Desert Fox outfoxed," announced the Chicago Tribune triumphantly. The American public, which had been nervously following a string of defeats and frustrating stalemates, suddenly had a clear victory. And more importantly, they had a genuine hero. Eisenhower, who had been under absolutely enormous pressure from Washington to deliver tangible results, sent Patton a terse message on February 15th. "You have given Americans something concrete to celebrate. Don't stop now." Privately, in his personal diary, Eisenhower wrote, "Patton is difficult, egotistical, and absolutely impossible to control effectively. He is also exactly what we desperately needed right now. The Germans now know definitively that Americans can fight, and they know we have commanders who can actually think strategically. That's worth all of Patton's considerable personality flaws combined." British reaction, British commanders, who had initially been quite skeptical of American military capability overall, began reassessing their views entirely. General Bernard Montgomery, not exactly known for showing generosity toward American generals, wrote to his chief of staff, "This Patton fellow has accomplished something genuinely remarkable. He's turned what was essentially rabble into real soldiers in just 3 weeks' time. I don't particularly like his methods, but I absolutely cannot argue with his results. If he continues performing this way, the Americans will reach Berlin before we do. German High Command Assessment. Within the German High Command, the implications were being debated with great urgency. If the Americans could produce a commander of Rommel's exceptional caliber, and if American soldiers could be transformed so rapidly from defeated troops into highly effective fighters, what did that ultimately mean for the war's eventual outcome? General Heinz Guderian, the original architect of German Blitzkrieg doctrine, wrote in his formal assessment, "We have awakened a sleeping giant, and we have given them sufficient time to find leaders truly worthy of their massive resources." This represents the beginning of our end. Rommel's personal letter. But perhaps the most revealing reaction of all came from Rommel himself in a personal letter to his wife Lucy, dated February 20th. This letter, which was discovered in archives after the war ended, shows a side of the Desert Fox that was rarely seen by anyone. "My darling, I have finally met my match on the battlefield. This American, Patton, fights with a fury and intensity that reminds me of myself 20 years ago. Even worse, he has clearly learned from studying all my mistakes. He fights like a German, but with distinctly American abundance of resources. I genuinely fear what comes next, not for myself personally, but for our entire cause. We simply cannot afford many more days like February 14th. Historical analysis. Now, let's discuss what military historians have to say when they analyze this single day's events from decades later. The Battle of Gafsa, as it eventually came to be known, though the actual fighting ranged across 50 square miles of desert, represents a genuine turning point, not just in the North African campaign specifically, but in military history's broader understanding of leadership impact on outcomes. Dr. Carlo d'Este, in his comprehensive biography of Patton, writes, February 14, 1943, clearly demonstrated that elite fighting forces are not born. They are deliberately created. Patton took the exact same men who had broken and fled at Kasserine Pass and, through a powerful combination of discipline, intensive training, and psychological manipulation, turned them into a force fully capable of defeating Rommel's veterans. The transformation happened in just 21 days. That fact alone should fundamentally revolutionize how we think about military leadership's role. British military historian Max Hastings offers this particular assessment. Rommel's defeat at Gafsa revealed the fundamental limitation of individual genius within modern warfare's context. The Desert Fox was absolutely brilliant tactically, but he was operating with severely limited intelligence, highly constrained supplies, and constant political interference from Berlin. Patton, on the other hand, had all the considerable advantages of American industrial might at his disposal. But more importantly than that, he had the complete freedom to act decisively without interference. The victory wasn't merely tactical in nature, it was systemic. German military analyst Franz Ulrich Wehler, in his detailed study of the Afrika Korps, provides the Axis perspective on events. February 14th was the precise day we lost North Africa, though the actual fighting would continue for 3 more months afterward. Rommel's aura of complete invincibility was shattered irreparably. Even worse, from our perspective, The Americans had proven they could learn quickly, adapt effectively, and execute highly complex operations successfully. From that day forward, every single German commander knew one thing with certainty: underestimate the Americans at your absolute peril. Strategic implications. The strategic implications unfolded progressively over the subsequent months. By May 1943, all Axis forces remaining in North Africa had surrendered completely. Over 275,000 troops became prisoners of war. The victory opened up the entire Mediterranean to Allied shipping operations, saved literally thousands of lives that would have been lost to shipping attacks, and provided the essential springboard for launching the invasion of Sicily and subsequently Italy. None of it would have been remotely possible if Patton hadn't stopped Rommel's momentum completely on that single February day. The power of belief and preparation. But there's a much deeper lesson here that transcends purely military history. What Patton demonstrated so clearly on February 14th was the tremendous power of belief when it's combined with meticulous preparation. He believed absolutely that the Americans could defeat Rommel's battle-hardened veterans. But he didn't just believe it in some abstract way. He prepared for it with absolutely obsessive attention to every detail, every single aspect of his plan, from the carefully crafted false intelligence to the precise positioning of forces to the exact timing of the attack, was calculated to maximize both psychological and tactical impact simultaneously. Consider the sheer audacity of what he attempted. Patton had been in command for exactly 21 days. Rommel had been fighting continuously in North Africa for 2 full years. By every conventional measure of military wisdom, Patton should have focused exclusively on rebuilding his forces, conducting extensive retraining, and slowly restoring shattered confidence. Instead, he immediately planned and executed an operation that required absolutely precise coordination, complete secrecy, and perfect timing across thousands of men and hundreds of vehicles. The margin for error was razor thin at every point. One single mistake, one intelligence leak, one miscalculation of timing or distance, and his entire force would have been completely destroyed in detail. Patton's philosophy. When Patton was asked after the war why he had taken such an enormous risk, his response was absolutely characteristic of his personality. There is simply no such thing as a defensive victory in warfare. I could have spent 6 comfortable months training those men in a safe rear area, and they would have remained defeated soldiers psychologically. Or I could give them 1 single day of absolute proof that they could beat the Germans in combat, and they would become conquerors. I chose conquest. The human cost of that choice is definitely worth examining carefully. American casualties on February 14th totaled 670 men who were killed, wounded, or missing in action. Each and every one of them was someone's son, brother, father, or husband. Patton's critics, both then and now, argue that a more cautious, conservative approach might have achieved similar strategic results with significantly fewer casualties overall. His defenders counter that cautious approaches in warfare rarely achieve anything meaningful except prolonged bloodshed spread over time. What absolutely cannot be disputed by anyone is the impact on those who survived that day. Veterans of the February 14th battle formed the experienced corps of units that would subsequently fight across Sicily, Italy, France, and eventually into Germany itself. They became the experienced cadre who trained countless other units, spreading Patton's aggressive doctrine throughout the entire American army. Their confidence, which was born in that single day of intense combat, influenced every subsequent battle they fought. The final analysis. In the final analysis, what Rommel wrote in his personal notes when Patton had outsmarted his entire carefully constructed strategy reveals something genuinely profound about leadership, warfare, and human potential itself. Rommel, the acknowledged master tactician, had been completely outthought by a commander who understood on a fundamental level that battles are actually won before they're ever fought, in the minds of soldiers, in the quality of intelligence gathered, in the boldness of conception and planning. The Desert Fox had built his legendary reputation specifically on doing the unexpected. Patton beat him decisively by being even more unexpected than Rommel himself. Rommel had always relied on exploiting the mistakes of his opponents. Patton deliberately gave him false information that was specifically designed to encourage mistakes. Rommel counted absolutely on speed and violence of action to win battles. Patton delivered both qualities in even greater measure. It was a masterclass demonstration of the principle that in war, just as in life, the student can eventually become the master. Conclusion. If you found this deep dive into military history genuinely fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button to Frontline America, World War II, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another video. Give this video a like if you truly appreciate the extensive research that goes into uncovering these untold stories from history. And please share this with any history enthusiasts you know personally. These stories absolutely deserve to be remembered and properly understood by future generations. Leave a comment and let me know, what other battles or commanders should we explore in future videos? The research never stops here, and your suggestions directly shape what videos we create next. Remember this lesson as you navigate your own challenges in life. Sometimes the impossible is just something that nobody has tried yet. Patton faced what seemed like an impossible situation, a beaten army, an undefeated opponent, and just 3 weeks to prepare for battle. He didn't see impossibility in that equation. He saw opportunity. That particular mindset, that absolute refusal to accept defeat before the battle even begins, is precisely what separates those who actually make history from those who merely witness it happening. The Desert Fox met his match on February 14, 1943, not because American equipment was superior, though that certainly helped the cause, not because American troops were more experienced in combat, they definitely weren't, but because one commander completely refused to fight the battle that everyone expected him to fight and instead created the specific conditions for a victory that no one thought was even possible. That's the crucial lesson Rommel learned that day. That's exactly what he wrote in his private notes, and that's precisely why 80 years later, we're still talking about what happened when these two military geniuses finally faced each other across a desert battlefield, and the impossible became inevitable.